As I think I've mentioned a number of times, one of my most delightful times during the course of a month or week by week is the Arcana class that we do in the lobby. We had it in the house in the manse for a while. And the study of the Arcana is a study, obviously, on so many levels of so many things, but so much is about the Lord's glorification and the way the Lord made, the way the divine made this human body that Jesus was born into, made that body and everything of that life, not just human, but they were all human, all the things the Lord did, but then the Lord completely glorified his divine. Excuse me. Completely glorified his human. Back when I was younger, studied this book, The Human Mind, and a course was given based on it in theological school. And one of the things we loved, some of us loved more than others, were the diagrams that various ministers of old and still today, the diagrams that would be drawn to help us understand and comprehend the things having to do with theology. I don't have a remote control here, so...
Left, right arrow keys, Michael.
Ain't it glorious? Now, I do have a couple copies of this. If somebody would like paper copy instead of the sheet, I can give you... Yeah? This. Print's getting a little smaller. Good, good. I have one more. And I'm sorry, Jerry, but I'm going to move this over even a little further. There we go. So what you have before you is a diagram of the human mind, according to Hugo Odhner's understanding of the way the writings describe the human mind. Now, I don't know, can I make that bigger?
Probably not keeping focus.
Oh, look at that. So you want to change your mind? You want to lose your mind? Or we'll just leave it like that and hope you can read it. Does that say everything about the human mind you could possibly wonder about? What do you think? On the extreme left-hand side, it says the mind, right? And I can't really point to it very well. And above it, it says the soul. And the mind is divided from the soul. But you don't have a mind unless the soul obviously is in the mind. And then at the very bottom, there's a long line across the very bottom, under which it says body. And I know for people like John Parker, it mentions the limbus, and he's always wanting me to discuss the limbus. All right? And below that, the mortal body from the material substances of nature. ISB, the intercourse between this mind and body. Number 8 talks about that. So this isn't just a diagram of the human mind. It's a diagram of everything from the body in its just pure biological state, straight up to the soul, and everything in between. So let's start down at the body, where it talks about the mortal body. We are just biological creatures, right? We're mammals, and depending on what you believe concerning evolution or not, we're very closely related with our biology to all the other mammals, but especially apes and chimpanzees and other primates. And the Lord managed to take that bunch of stuff that he created anyway and provide us with a brain that would develop an ability to be rational and develop an ability to be spiritual and celestial. seems to be less popular to say celestial than heavenly lately. I'm not sure I like that. Celestial to me is kind of, I guess, like the term conjugal. I like conjugal, although a lot of people like marriage better. So in between the body and the soul, we have the mind. And again, the left-hand side, the second layer in talks about the natural and the spiritual mind. And then a little further to the left, as you keep going to the right, you get 3 levels of the mind: the sensual, the natural, and the rational. You all see that, right? Okay. Now we've got columns and rows, as it were. I'm going to start again down at the bottom. You have a corporeal, an exterior sensual, and an interior sensual to that sensual, right? Right here. And this goes all the way up and covers a bunch of stuff over there. That is the sensual and the natural. But when you talk about the natural mind, you're going all the way up to here. And then the rational mind starts above, but is the highest level of, the rational mind is the highest level of the natural mind. Does that make sense to you?
There are 2 naturals. 3 actually.
There's 1, 2,
I
3.
mean, there's a natural and spiritual mind, and then the natural mind is broken up into the sensual, natural, and rational.
And the natural mind is also, broken up. Those 3. So there's quasi-discrete degrees. When the writings give us information about how we operate, and as it said in that one passage, the passage I read, so many things can't be comprehended. But just because you can't be comprehended doesn't mean you don't have to believe it. There's a lot of things that we need to believe even if we don't understand. And that's not saying we need to have a blind faith. It's just saying we have to have humility to recognize we cannot understand everything of theology. That's sort of an obvious statement to say that. How could we possibly understand everything about God and about how God made us and how God glorified himself to become the divine human? But this diagram kind of helps us understand who we are and what's operating at what levels. So the human is said to begin in the rational. The human is said to begin in the rational because there are animals that have a corporeal degree, an exterior sensual, and an interior sensual. You can get baboons to count the number of people that walked into the forest up to, 6 or something, 5, I forget. But they know, their imagination can still tell them, there's people still in the forest. They can count, they can remember, they can not go into the forest if they saw 4 go in and only 2 come out. They know there's still 2 in there. It's amazing what the animals can do, right? We all know of the wonderful things that animals can memorize and be able to go through circuits and do amazing things because they have an imagination. We think they do. We can't really talk to them and ask them. Maybe someday we'll have better techniques of brain scanning. But we have a hard enough time just figuring ourselves out, let alone the animal kingdom. But amazingly, biology works wonderfully, and the natural part of the mind, or the natural part of the brain that is in a creature, does phenomenal things with what looks like rationality. Dogs making, really important choices. And so many people who love their pets and treat them like people, because sometimes animals behave better than people do. And when you talk to your dog, they won't talk back. So when you look at that lower natural, and that is this bracket here, right? When it says the natural, it includes the rational on this level, and then it looks like the rational goes above the natural up into here. But then it looks like it doesn't, because the natural goes on this one here all the way up to the spiritual. And the celestial mind, the spiritual mind, and the natural mind. Now, back in the theological days of Hugo Odhner, and this is material that's right in this book here from Hugo Odhner. They were trying to figure out lots of important things when the church began. And Hugo Odhner was a lot closer to the beginning of the church than I am, or you are. And his father, Carl Theophilus Odhner, was one of the leaders of the Academy movement that separated from convention back in the day. But they loved to have a lot of important arguments about the limbus and the nature of the first finite point, and the correlation between Swedenborg's scientific works and his theological works. So if you look at the copies of New Church Life that are back there on the shelves in the as you go up to the balcony, used to be in the sitting room, as I recall, you'll see the copies of New Church Life that are this thick, and then this thick, and then this thick, and then this thick, through about 1916, 1918, 1920, when they had to figure out the important things related to the first finite point, the nature of spirits in the other world, and the limbus. Yes?
I went to school with Hugo.
Yes.
I thought Growth of the Mind was written by Dr. George DeCharms.
George DeCharms wrote books about the growth of the mind.
I thought that was book was written by him.
That's not the growth of the mind. That's
Right,
what
so-
Hugo said.
Hugo.
Yeah, the growth of the mind and just the human mind. The subtitle to that is Its Faculties and Degrees. So this was written after Growth of the Mind, which was written in the 30s, I believe. This, I believe, was written in the 60s, but probably came out of studies that he was doing in the 40s and 50s. So I'm not sure I understand a lot about this. Isn't it great to give a class about something you confess you don't understand? But I'm very interested in it. I'm very interested in it. And I'm also very interested in the distinctions that Hugo Odhner makes around the nature of the scientific teachings that were really, what he was up on at the time during the 50s and 60s, into the 70s and 80s. I believe he had a stroke around 70, 71, somewhere in there. And when I knew him, when I came down to Bernathen in 72, he was still up and around, but you could hardly understand his speech because of the stroke he had had. And then he passed away sometime, I don't know, probably late 70s, mid 70s. So I know him a lot from the theological works that we did in theological school, the classes we have. And then also because he was one of the primary champions of the conflict going on between the Lord's New Church and the general church. He and Alfred Acton and Bishop DeCharms were the three primary writers that were sort of crossing doctrinal swords with Ernest Pfeiffer and Grunewald, I forget his first, Harry Grunewald, and Theo Pitcairn. So you have these three theologues here and these three theologians here. And so a lot of the stuff that Hugo Odhner, who I loved reading, studying in theological school, and learning more and studying it more, I still like, well, how did he see that? And I haven't yet reached some point in the rational mind to really comprehend a lot of what they talk about. So I'm going to open up, oh man, my first slide. Drew a blank. How about that one? Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
I got to find where it is in the book because I want to talk about it from here. And look, I spared you this really cool other diagram. A lot more words on there. The degrees of the rational mind is where I got into. He talks about the types of the rational mind. If man were imbued with no hereditary evil, The rational would then be born immediately from the marriage of the celestial things of the internal man with its spiritual things, and the scientific, or the faculty of knowing, would be born through the rational, so that on coming into the world, a person, he uses man all the time that way, a man would at once have in himself the whole rational and the whole scientific. For this would be in accordance with the order of influx. That's from two passages and others in the Arcana. Something similar is true of animals who are born with instinct. In today's world, it's hard for people to separate the intelligence of animals from the intelligence of human beings. And as we look at what's happening culturally and what people call reasonable, just, and fair, and what laws are instituted to allow people to do what they consider reasonable, just, and fair, or equitable, you find that it's hard for there to be what back in the old days people would commonly just understand to be orderly, and now, animals do it, so why shouldn't we? And animals are good, right? And we understand from the teachings of the Word in the Arcana that animals, really, they're born into the order of their creation, and if we were good, we would be born that way too. But because of hereditary evil, that option has been wiped out. Now, here, I want you to put on your best objective thinking caps to help me analyze this and the following passage. The rational differs according to sex. Both men and women have rational minds, yet the man has as his particular function the cultivation of the things of wisdom, the perpetuation of the abstract and rational things of doctrine and philosophy, and of the sciences which are basic to these abstract. Men are fitted for this function because their affection is more readily detachable from their thought, and they can therefore be elevated into rational and spiritual light and maintain the elevation. Women, how's that make you feel?
Fine.
It's fine? Okay.
Multitask.
We can multitask. Yeah. So that's a basic and pretty standard understanding of conjugal love and the elevation of the male into the light of heaven, the way it's explained. He doesn't give passages here, but in the next passage, I believe at the end you'll see a lot of numbers that confirm that. So the second paragraph in this thing is that women, on the other hand, can be elevated into a superior heat and can steadily maintain the elevation. And it is from this feminine sphere of spiritual heat that the masculine intellect can be conjoined with a spiritual love and thus find permanent illustration. Even as it is by virtue of the masculine presentation of abstract truth that the woman can come to feel the inner delights of her heat or her rational or spiritual affections. It's a great formula for making an angel. And I have very little argument. I might have written this out differently. This is a direct quote from this book. But pretty much, no, this is the way our minds are built to operate. And it's not to say that there aren't a lot of wise women, and not to say that there aren't a lot of affectional and very deeply loving men. That's not against that. It's just saying the rational mind is different between males and females. And when the two can come together because of the heat of what is received into the female through conjugal love, which is she's a receptor of that in ways that the male is not, then that elevated mind of the male can be maintained with the elevated heat of the female. Great combination. Any thoughts about that or reflections?
Yeah, I'd like to say that's all probably connected with women and male ministers, right?
Say again?
This is all one of the arguments for or against female ministers.
I would say it's in this comprehension of the ability of the male mind to be in a certain abstract level of light, differently from the affections that would be maintaining that's not the place for women to be. And that in the contention between abstract thoughts and ideas, abstracted from affection, that men can battle with each other and argue and not go to war, but yeah, spiritually or theologically speaking or philosophically speaking, without necessarily feeling like you're being insulted that somebody doesn't believe the same thing you do. Whereas the investment of loves, generally with the feminine, incline me not to want to enter into that kind of tit-for-tat bantering that is common in amongst men. So that's where my comfort level myself would be less. I wouldn't be so comfortable in council of the clergy that included both males and females for the sake of not wanting to say things. Perhaps it's my hang-up to women who I disagreed with in the way I disagree with them. Roger?
It always strikes me that, I can look at a problem, try to figure out the answer, go around it about 6 or 7 times, maybe come to some conclusions as to what the answer might be on the first round, maybe get a little more enlightenment on the second. The third, well, I fall back to the first one because it sort of negates all that I've thought before. And then I speak to my wife and she knows the answer right like that. How does that happen?
I ask her. Yeah, there is a...
She knows the answer before I even really got the problem.
There's something talked about a lot in the writings about feminine perception. The ability to not have to think it out on the analytical, rational, linear way of looking, but have a feel for what's right in your relationship and what's right for you. And therefore, if you're approaching it with the wrong approach, I think our wives can help us see that better than we can see it ourselves.
I've experienced the same thing that Roger has. But that goes with abstract things that have to do with business or finance. It's quite a broad scale on which they operate. And I have real questions when you say that some areas women can't go into that men can't. I think there's a lot of difference in the minds of women, just as there is in the minds of men.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I can't speak for any women because I'm not a woman, and I certainly can't speak for a lot of men in terms of the way they might think. I can barely speak for myself sometimes in what I'm thinking. And I think that is one of the shortfalls of an argument that just comes from men about the nature of women is, yeah, we can be abstract and we can be more objective, perhaps, but in fact, the true rational isn't made up of being able to detach from love to be objective. The true rational isn't about seeing truths. That's the Ishmael rational. It's the start. The true rational is about love, giving perception and conscience, and then rationality developing into wisdom, because true rationality will be the beginning of wisdom, not a lot of Ishmael rational sword fighting and argument, in my understanding. But I think, no, I'll keep moving. The rational can't be built up by men or women alone, nor can the rational of a woman who is born to act from affection emulate that of a man who is from birth destined to look from understanding and to cultivate judgment, nor vice versa. Such emulations lead to gross self-deceptions which make a travesty of rational thinking. For reason can flourish in both men and women, but never in a mind that has lost its sex. To think that men can say, well, we can understand women and can speak objectively about it is foolish. It reminds me of the passage where Swedenborg's talking to an angelic husband about his wisdom, and then he says, because he says something about, well, you should meet our wives. I forget the exact quote. And Swedenborg says, well, what has a woman to do with wisdom? to which the angels laugh. They call he's speaking to one angel, he calls his buddies and says, this man wants to know what women have to do with wisdom. I don't know if they're all laughing, and they don't be, angelic laughing. It wouldn't be terribly insulting. But it would bring a smile on your face, and you're thinking about talking about this man, however old he was in the natural world, but an unmarried man. The Lord was able to use him for all the things he needed to be a revelator, but perhaps his enlightenment about marriage on his own would lead him to ask such a question. And the Lord was using that because basically the culture, and still today, the culture is ignorant about what true wisdom is. What would it have to do with a woman? And you think all those old white men that are doing all the stuff in their universities and whatnot that people will be derisive about. But in fact, there is something to a bunch of men trying to figure out the world and thinking they're so wise without women. Intelligence, knowledgeable, able to manipulate knowledge and intelligence for the sake of many things, but genuine wisdom doesn't exist without conjugal love. That's the origin of genuine wisdom, is the pulling together of the things of love, the things of affection, and the things of truth, things of the understanding. So the human rational is distinguished into two types, not only by reason of race or sex, but also according to the affections which motivate and head it. Therefore, we learn in the Arcana how the rational gradually changes its quality as a people's character develop and they are regenerated. This is told in the internal sense of the story of Abram's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Well, Abram only had one son, and that's Ishmael. And then Abraham had one son named Isaac, because the name was changed. The Ishmael rational. Now, I tend to think of that not as a teenage state, which I was sort of inclined to believe back when I was in theological school, but as a state that is pretty prevalent through most of our maturing lives. I'll read this passage. The judgment exercised by this first rational, the Ishmael rational, is immature and superficial, sometimes. It lacks sympathy and therefore fails to understand the complex states of human life, most times. It does not penetrate below appearances. Really, Hugo? Such a rational is impatient and intolerant even with himself. Yeah? And grows bitter and discouraged. This judgment is compared to unripe, sour fruit and not sufficiently exposed to the sunshine of charity. And that really, I just love the way he put that. I do love his writing. It's compared to unripe or sour fruit, not sufficiently exposed to the sunshine of charity. Yet it is within this first rational that spiritual freedom begins to be exercised. In its endeavor towards self-compulsion and submission to the dictates of truth, it begins to receive a new and heavenly proprium, a new character from the Lord. All those passages, by degrees, affections of good and truth are implanted as seeds of a new beginning. The fruit ripens, the judgment mellows. All in that Ishmael rational state. And so what is going to come next? Raise your hands if you know. The Isaac rational. The second rational. There aren't two rationals. Go back to that diagram. It doesn't talk about the Ishmael and the Isaac rational the same way. It's one developing into the other. It's a level of the use of the rational mind that is motivated by charity and love. The second rational is formed from spiritual affections, quote, implanted by the Lord in a wonderful manner in the truths of the first rational. And as this is being done, the things which are in agreement are vivified, but the rest are separated as useless. Yet the first rational, with everything in it, all its states, remains. It is not removed, but only put aside. To indicate the totally different nature of the second rational, the word represents it by Isaac, the son of Abraham by his wife Sarah. Isaac, the man of peace, represented an affection of heavenly truth and a new state in which man believes that the good and truth which he receives are not from himself, so that he disclaims pride and merit and begins to feel delight in good and truth for their own sake. One moment you can be thinking how good you are, and the next moment you can look at that thought and think, I have no good in me, all good is from the Lord. One moment you're thinking like an Ishmael rational, and the next moment you're Isaac rational, or another aspect of your rational looks at yourself and says, ew, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that way. And we go through that state, don't we, constantly during the course of a day or a year or a month, or a day or a month or a year? To be reformed and to be regenerated by the Lord is the constant switching between the things of the proprium that we want to do that we know are wrong, and yet we'll find a way to do it. The Ishmael rational is very clever. And then the Isaac rational that says, hey, that's not who you really are. That's not who you really want to be. And as he even says, the Ishmael rational doesn't disappear. It's always there. And when it's being motivated, when our mind is being motivated by selfish loves, we're going to be able to think through from an Ishmael rational state. And when we allow the Lord's good and truth to motivate us and give us thoughts, we're operating out of the Isaac rational.
And that's when you feel delight.
Yes. Well, you can feel delight in the Ishmael rational too.
Just that last sentence. That's when the delight, you actually begin to
Feel delight in good and truth for their own sake. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a nice state.
Oh, yeah.
This is where we now take, for Roger's sake, a 10-minute break. Roger was telling me about going to a class with Hugo Odhner, and he went on for about 40, 45 minutes. Roger's a young teenager, and winds it up, and Roger's thinking, finally I can get out of this and go do something fun. And Hugo, now we will take a 10-minute break. And they came back for another 45 minutes. Yes, David.
Hugo was known for having a very slow delivery, a very thoughtful approach, but he was a very slow thinker and speaker.
Right.
And we used to get very, very tired of waiting for him to get
To the next sentence, yeah. Yeah. I worry about getting that way myself. I'm not sure if it's from the same intelligence or just, I don't know, growing old. trying to think through what I really want to say.
But as a preacher, they would say that when he was preaching, roast would burn all over town.
Oh, dear. So on that chart, if you have a copy of it, you can look at where it talks about the sensual, the interior sensual or imaginative, and the interior natural. What's the difference between those? Or the rational are quite discrete from each other, or interior natural or rational. They're quite discrete from each other, and yet these 3 degrees of the natural, remember how I gave you that chart and it showed the natural goes all the way up here and then the spiritual, but also the natural only goes up here, and then it has these other parts to it. Kind of have to ask yourself, when you die, what parts are you taking with you when you get to the other world? You take your limbus. Without that, you have nowhere to walk. You take everything. Not my genes.
Or, deeds.
Genes or deeds?
Not your deeds, I think he said. I'm not sure if he said genes or deeds.
Well, those two. But.
So you don't in one sense take much material stuff at all, and yet you never lose anything that you ever did. And the limbus is basically the finest things of nature that allow you to continue to eternity from having started here on earth. Not that I comprehend the limbus very well. It simply means border in Latin. It's the border between the natural and the spiritual. So you have to have that to continue your existence. It's sort of the antithesis of reincarnation. The reason why there is no reincarnation is that once born and in a soul and in a body, in the body, and you go into the other world, you can't lose the limbus and then start a new one somewhere else. Where the tree falls, there it lies. So these three lowest parts of the natural mind are the sensual, the interior sensual, and the interior natural. All these 3 degrees of the natural are characterized by a common quality which is not discrete but continuous. What's the difference between a discrete and continuous degrees? Does anybody have an easy answer? You know what that means when you say a continuous degree as opposed to a discrete degree?
The other, discrete is like a step.
Discrete, it's good to think of discrete as
As compared to linear.
it's so, yeah, but an easy thing, if you have steps, actually, they're not discrete. In one sense, they're still made out of wood and they're all going from one spot to the next. So, but you could say you're continually going up by these distinctive steps. A discrete, the difference between end, cause, and effect. Just think about cause and effect as a abstract thing. You know, what causes winter to happen now and then summer's going to come later? What causes that? It's seen in its effect, but there's a distinction between the cause and the effect in the natural world. There's a distinction between our will and our understanding doing something in the spiritual world and then the effect on earth. Those are distinct degrees. You can't get there from here. You can't study your way up into the celestial by all the spiritual things that you know. The celestial is a distinct degree above the spiritual, as an end in itself is distinct from a cause, and a cause is distinct from the effect. So the spiritual world and the natural world aren't on a continuous degree. And of course that's lost in much New Age thinking, where people say if you have the right odors and the right vibrations, that, you know, if you can think in a vibratory way, you can open up the spiritual, and as if there's something that has to do with the natural that will get you into the spiritual. You are a spirit living in a natural body. They're working really well together, your soul, your mind, and your body, but they're distinct. They're very distinct, discrete. Whereas this mind stuff of the rational mind, it looks as if it's distinct and discrete from each other, but it's really on a continuous thing. What is central, what is of the imaginative, what is of the lowest rational, are on a developmental level. The brain can start comprehending certain things at 25 that it couldn't at 2. But it's really a continuous development, even into the things of theology or philosophy, abstract things, engineering, mathematics, calculus, physics, metaphysics. Those are still all on a continuous basis of knowledges that come into the mind through the senses, are analyzed by the brain or by the mind through the imagination and the lower sensual and interior natural, to the level of the highest comprehension of things in abstract ways. The natural mind as a whole grows by knowledges which increase not by discrete steps, but by an imperceptible accumulation, so that the field of a person's thought continually expands during the process of education. It is the same with every part of the natural mind. Its highest degree, the rational, is discretely distinct from the imagination, but it isn't. The rational contains discrete elements. In one passage, it is shown that the rational faculty is open to the first degree by civil truths, the second degree by moral truths, the third degree by spiritual truths, and by the respective virtues of those levels. But, sorry to yell at you, but in the divine love and wisdom it is explained that man's rational, since it can be elevated to understand truths even to the inmost degree in which are the angels of the third heaven, thereby make may take on an appearance as if of 3 degrees, irrational from the celestial, irrational from the spiritual, and irrational from the natural. In this faculty of thinking and speaking about heavenly truths, I'm going to stop here. So we have distinctions and very discrete distinctions, but the discrete degrees in the natural mind of civil truths, spiritual truths, and theological truths, it isn't the same kind of discrete degree as you have between end, cause, and effect. People who are elevating their understanding above their will, it's just saying here that evil people, when they're on earth, the natural mind cannot be raised, I'm in the middle of that passage, into angelic light itself, or into angelic wisdom itself, but only into a higher light, even up to the angels, so as to perceive naturally, thus not so fully, what the angels perceive spiritually. We're stuck in the natural world. Human wisdom. How wise can we be? Can we be as wise as the angels, in the light of heaven as the angels are? It appears as if Swedenborg certainly was brought into and had commerce, intellectual, spiritual commerce, interaction with the angels. Do we get to do that? Human wisdom, while we are in the natural world, is natural, and, quote, can by no means be raised into angelic wisdom, but only into some image of it. This is true of good people and devils alike. There are differences between good people and devils. The person who is in evils and falsities, when they raise their thought above the things of the natural mind, in other words, they're thinking about spiritual things, they find that the lights begin to cool and perish, and so their apparent wisdom does. However it may have ascended, it falls back again to the level of their own love. For they perceive that they have nothing to gain by any elevation of the rational. The only thing to gain is, oh, how wise you are, and people giving you. Basically to keep on that level, if you're not really pursuing the Lord, or you're not really pursuing charity to the neighbor, why would you bother staying up there in, handling those things of wisdom that give angels delight, but if you're not really trying to be a better person, why stay there? And that's what it says in those passages in DLW. So even if an evil person succeeds by reason of native ability or training in maintaining his elevation so as to appear rational in a higher degree, it is said of such a person that he is, quote, rational only in the ultimate degree, or merely naturally rational. So you're back down to those 3 levels of the sensual, the corporeal, and the imaginative, the interior natural, the exterior natural, and the corporeal. Most of everything we're doing, interaction in the world, is in that level of the mind. People don't become rational by thought alone. A person becomes rational according to their love, that is elevated along with their understanding. Love is elevated when the will, instructed by the understanding, begins to be purified by the shunning of evils as sins against God. If the understanding is elevated into the acknowledgement of spiritual truths and the seeing of spiritual goods, and the love is also elevated and conjoined with the understanding, then a person becomes rational in a higher degree, or rational from the spiritual. And in the development and discussion of this throughout the Arcana, where it talks about that doctrine itself must be celestial in a spiritual base, or spiritual from a celestial origin. It's that descent of love into the things of the higher mind, the rational, that allow us to be and really have true doctrine. And it's not simply the manipulation of doctrinal ideas or concepts that a very, very bright person can be brilliantly, quote-unquote, wise, but not necessarily. Any theological person, I can spout all sorts of things and sound as if I have the doctrine of the church. But really, the genuine doctrine of the church doesn't come in to the mind any but from a spiritual, out of a celestial origin. So it's descending and flowing in, and this is basically what that passage is talking about. Man becomes rational in a higher degree, or rational from the spiritual.
Conjoined is the operative word there.
Yes, there's a conjunction between love and wisdom, good and truth, in the spiritual level that flows into the rational, in the celestial level that flows into the spiritual, into the rational. A new quality is then imposed upon the rational mind when spiritual life is underway. A quality which is due to a discrete illustration from within by the light of the spiritual degree. Two passages. When a person whose love ascends, well, it's actually given from the divine to us, appears as if it ascends, along with his thoughts. When these are raised to spiritual and celestial things, the rational mind is therefore distinguished into degrees, which are discrete, not merely continuous. Discrete because spiritual love flowing down into the rational is discrete and different from celestial love flowing down into the rational. It's possible then for a person on reflection to discern whether they are thinking sensually or rationally. So you can look at yourself and say, that wasn't very spiritual when you were acting from lower loves. It's sometimes therefore possible to see that one is thinking from truths or about truths which are typical of the natural heaven, or of the spiritual heaven, or of the inmost heaven. Have you ever caught yourself or reflected or meditated and seen that taking place within your mind? It's a blessing if you have, or you do, to have the sense of the Lord's love with you, and a sense of that celestial presence. Hence the rational actually appears distinguished in degrees, but it's not possible in this world to ascertain whether one's will or love is elevated into the same degree as the understanding. Thus, whether one has become rational to this degree or that degree. No one can, nor can this be determined by other people. We pray that that's what's taking place in our rational development. We can't make the ultimate judgment about ourselves. We don't have that objectivity. The Lord doesn't give it to us for a lot of good reasons. We have to, as if of ourselves, shun evils as sins. The Lord is building those levels of the mind with us. I think I have 2 more slides left. The 3 degrees of the rational are indeed basic to the 3 heavens, but it would be an error to altogether identify these 3 degrees of the rational with the natural mind, the spiritual mind, and the celestial mind, which are the 3 spiritual degrees in general. The rational is the means whereby a person may acquire the truths by which a conscience is built up from within, so that there may be in his terminations or planes of receptive the life of the heavens, to receive those things. I had a lot more than I thought. Pardon? So towards the end of this chapter, this is what Hugo says. Our endeavor has been to show that the use to which a person employs his rational mind, this will determine what kind of angels can find a lodging place with him. The use to which you employ your rational mind. You're thinking about serving the Lord and trying to find the Lord in all things that you do. Find the neighbor, love towards the neighbor in all things that you do. The Lord will build your rational mind on that celestial and spiritual level. You want to be obedient to the Lord and be a good servant and a good member of society, the Lord will build that rational mind of the natural plane. And the angels who are in those loves will find a dwelling place with you. And your associate angels will be able to practice more deeply with you, because those degrees that they're in are the degrees that you're coming into, because you're striving for that. Through the interior natural, so long as a person does not close their mind against spiritual acknowledgments, he may acquire a moral conscience and thus prepare himself for life in the ultimate heaven. through the exterior rational. So we got the interior rational, the exterior rational, and the interior rational, these three levels. Through the exterior rational, a person may come to understand and love spiritual truths and have their spiritual mind opened, and after death, enter into the marvelous gifts of intelligence which are stored therein, becoming an angel of the second heaven. And through their interior rational, they may conceive a celestial love of uses by which the celestial mind within him will be unlocked, and as a celestial angel, he may then enter into wisdom inconceivable. In the next chapter, which we're not getting into, we propose to discuss the mysterious relationship between the natural mind and these interior and superior degrees, called the spiritual and celestial, which we know from no other source than the writings. And finally, it ends with, I put that in again at the end. There's so much to the way the Lord has revealed the operation of our mind. I read that first passage for the worship because it talks about the Lord without the glorification, where the Lord ordered all of these degrees of the mind within himself into good order, to be a good human being, but no more than that, into a divine order. That without that work of the Lord glorifying his human mind to become a divinely human mind and put it in these places, and he was the only one born, as opposed to the way it talks about animals having no instinct, he was born a divine being. So his soul, at the very top, was divine, ours isn't. And I think depending on how we understand the business about the body and the limbus, the Lord's limbus is a very different, my understanding, but I don't think I understand it very well, the very different limbus than our limbus. And in one sense you could say it's basically his limbus, the lowest things of his divine, that are, as a sense, the highest things of our ability to find him. That he came in and glorified everything of the human, including the body, including the limbus, and made it divine. And that really, really cleansed heaven, cleansed the world of spirits, ordered hell, so that now our rational minds can open up and not be hit with all the things that were clouding up the spiritual world, causing many of the judgments that took place at the end of various churches. But the last judgment of 1757, when the Lord glorified his human on earth at the end of the Jewish church, the beginning of the Christian church, but even more so with the glorification of the divine rational as given in the second coming, that now these things are ordered. We can come to comprehend it, and our generation doesn't depend upon being able to recite back everything said by the writings concerning the rational. It's not a matter of thought. It's not a matter of being able to manage all these bits of truths. It's a matter of loving. It's a matter of wanting to get closer to the Lord, wanting to see the Lord as a human being who loves us, and all the things that he did as aspects of love, so that we can emulate those things, be more like him, and have our minds put into the same order that his mind was put into. That is, obviously shunning evils as sins, but most especially then to love one another as he loves us. Do this commandment, the Lord said, and should truly be not a servant or a slave in his kingdom, but as it were a friend to all things divine. Thoughts? Reflections? Yes,
We're all
Margaret?
going to get to that step differently.
Yes.
We're not all going to go in a line because we're going to go that way or we're going to go this way. It's individual.
Yes and no, we will all do it the same way, because in one sense, being human, we'll do it the human way. But I think we'll all do it individually. There's 12 gates to the city. And yet, these developmental stages, pretty well laid out, that these will...
But we have to make sure we go that way.
Yes. Jared?
It just occurred to me that it's probably very analogous with pregnancy and childbirth. There's a process there, and
Right.
There are some things that never happen, some stages that are consistent, but every woman I've ever heard talks about how every pregnancy is different.
Right.
Michael, I'm very lost, but how do you get the different remains? Because I just thought there were remains. I didn't know there were all types. do you get better, if you're a better person, because it's supposed to be laid down when you're young, so I don't see why. How do you decide which kind you're likely to get?
You don't.
Well, it says based on celestial, based on, and it sounds like we, so what's the difference? I mean, it sounds like people who get the celestial ones have got a better chance of something than the people who just get the regular ones.
Well, I think the Lord gives us the remains that we have no responsibility to receive. I mean, in terms of a baby doesn't manage their own gifting of remains. The Lord manages all the remains, but as we mature through the development of the natural into the spiritual mind, we are able to put ourselves in states that the Lord can give us the more superior remains that come with adult life compared to the ones of the innocence, remains of innocence and ignorance that are different from the remains of innocence and wisdom.
But I thought all remains were laid down when you were young.
No. Remains are laid down. Hopefully you've gotten some remains from listening to the teachings of the Word tonight. They'll be there. There'll be remnants, things that will stay with you of the divine as a result of hearing the Lord's Word being taught. We get remains all our lifetime long, which is wonderful. The Lord never gives up on us.
Michael, the way I feature that is that, okay, the remains come along. The reception of it is in the various minds of the level of the mind. That can differ, but it still is the same basic remains coming through. It would be more meaningful to someone or to a higher level of a mindset, and it could work its way up in that particular way.
So you're talking about your infant remains developing in your later years?
Whatever, any particular situation.
Well, they come out as what gives us the ability to receive a new proprium, a new heavenly proprium. But we receive remains throughout our life, and they're new remains. They're new remains.
Well, isn't that part of the Lord working in our lives in the way we can't see? We don't know.
Right.
But what we take in that can touch our hearts, and that's part of the Lord's presence with us.
Yes, the Lord's presence with us is a gifting of remains as well. We will be affected by the Lord's presence with us. The Holy Spirit is operating at all times. We receive more of it in certain states than others, and one easy mechanism to receive the Lord's life is to shun evils as sins. And as we develop and grow, we do it for more and more divinely inspired reasons. At first we just don't want to get in trouble and we don't want to go to hell. Sometimes we still think that way, but hopefully more and more we're thinking, I want to be a better person to serve my neighbor, and I want to be more in the image and likeness of the Lord. So I want to shun this evil as a sin. Okay? Yes, Jared?
I just feel compelled to point out the title of that picture. It's a general picture, general degrees. In other words, it's vague and imprecise.
It is. There's actually a 12-volume set that goes with this. Right. and a lot of this work that Hugo Odhner did is based on divine love and wisdom. You probably noticed that because divine love and wisdom is the angelic wisdom concerning the Lord's development of the cycle of remains, creation, the gifting of life, the returning of life. And so in those last 300s and 400s in the TLW, a lot about the nature of the degrees of the mind.